George Bisharat is a professor of law at the University of California, Hastings. In this installment, he'll be discussing the recent op-ed by Judge Richard Goldstone. In the Washington Post piece, Goldstone questions the UN report he co-authored about Israel's operation in Gaza 2 years ago. This is Palestine Studies TV, and I'm your host, Will Yeomans. Joining us today is Professor George Bisharat. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
So what's at stake with the Goldstone op-ed? Goldstone himself said in a follow-up interview with the Associated Press that there's really no reason to believe any part of the report needs to be reconsidered at this time.
Well, it's relevant, but far less so than had it been a more fulsome retraction than it actually was, and if these subsequent statements hadn't been made both by Goldstone himself and by the other three participants in the original report. I think now that we have those further statements, the op-ed, the significance of the op-ed diminishes considerably. You know, the document has been voted on and approved by the United Nations General Assembly, and there is no actual mechanism for the retraction or the rescission of a UN General Assembly resolution. So you know, even if Richard Goldstone had fully repudiated the findings of the report, which of course he did not. But even if he had done so, it would have had no legal effect. It would have no impact on the standing of the report as it is progressing through the UN system.
In your San Francisco Chronicle piece, you made some important points. Goldstone retracted a claim that was never made in the report, and that most of the essential findings remain unchallenged. Now, Goldstone himself lauded an Israeli self-investigation despite having criticized those kinds of investigations for years. So what exactly is at play here? Is there a coherent logic that Goldstone is advancing now?
Well, I think there is a kind of there's maybe a coherence in the tone of the piece, which was, I think, intended to be conciliatory toward Israel, but in terms of its internal logic, perhaps less so. It had the hallmarks of a hastily written piece. I mean, imagine the name of the Samoni family was even misspelled, or at least not spelled in the same way as it had been in the original Goldstone report. So, you know, it was a bit of an unusual statement, and like I said, I think it bears the hallmark of haste and sort of more emotion than logic. Let me explain, though, the statement that I made in the Chronicle, which I didn't really, in that short piece, didn't have space to elaborate on. But the original report, with some narrow exceptions, didn't really accuse the Israeli military of going after and hunting down Palestinian civilians. What it did say is that Israel used lax rules of, or likely used lax rules of engagement, and engaged in both indiscriminate and disproportionate warfare, also deliberately attack civilian infrastructure with the foreseeable consequence that this would kill a lot of civilians. Now, those are war crimes. They're not the same war crime as going and deliberately killing civilians, but those are war crimes. The narrow exception pertains to Palestinian civilian policemen. Now, there were 99 of them killed in the initial wave of attacks at about 11:30 in the morning on the 27th of December, and then a further, well, a total of 248 Palestinian civilian policemen were killed. Under international law, policemen, whether they work for Hamas or the Palestinian Authority or anybody else, are not combatants unless they actually engage in combat. And of course, with respect to those 99 who were killed in the first minutes of the attack, there was no possible way they could have been involved in combat because there wasn't any combat until they were dead already. And then with respect to the vast majority of the others, there was apparently no evidence that they were in fact engaged in combat. So that's the single category of civilians. Now it's a significant exception in that, you know, 1 in 6 of the casualties caused during the fighting were Palestinian civilian policemen. But that is the only category of civilian that Israel was accused of deliberately targeting. The other part of your question regarding Israel's self-investigation, I think he shows some, what shall I say, perhaps unrealistic, unfounded optimism about the capacity of the Israeli military to investigate itself. As you may know, the Israeli military has launched some 400 investigations into individual incidents, but those have proceeded at a very low pace. Nearly 2 years after the incident, the incidents, more than 2 years, I should say. There have been only three convictions in relatively minor cases, and punishments have been slight. And more importantly, another UN body headed by retired New York Supreme Court Justice Mary McGowan Davis has found that the mechanism for Israeli investigations really doesn't permit it to investigate matters of policy and the responsibility or culpability of upper-level Israeli military brass. So it is only designed to investigate essentially individual incidents. And of course, the real problem with Operation Cast Lead wasn't the actions of individual Israeli soldiers. Sure, there may have been bad behavior and bad conduct by individuals, but the basic problem had to do with strategic choices and policy directives and broad, that is to say, lax rules of engagement. It really wasn't just a matter of a few bad apples. It was really the entire approach that the Israeli military took to this incident, to this military combat.
I have a question, Professor Bisharat, about the long-term credibility of the United Nations. We both know that there's many critics who accuse the United Nations of having an anti-Israel agenda. Now, I ask this because, for example, some in the U.S. Congress are using the op-ed as a basis for criticizing the United Nations, and they're calling for the U.S. government to push the General Assembly to revoke the report.
This is just, as far as I'm concerned, political grandstanding, and I don't think it's going to have any real impact on what's going on in the United Nations. I do think, however, that this is extremely irresponsible and risky behavior by the U.S. Congress, because essentially what it does is it telegraphs to Israel that Congress has your back. And that is exactly the kind of message that Israel will take the next time, or will consider the next time it decides to launch another deadly attack, whether on the Gaza Strip or on Lebanon or some of its other hapless neighbors.
Shifting gears here a little, Professor Bisharat, I wanted to talk to you about this conference that you helped organize at your law school, University of California, Hastings, on how Palestinians can use the courts to achieve justice against Israel. I understand that the board of directors came under severe external pressure and ended up disassociating the school from the conference itself. What took place, and was there any fallout?
Well, it was made in response not to public pressure, but rather to private pressure. That was basically orchestrated by several local organizations within the Jewish community, the Jewish Community Relations Council, the Anti-Defamation League local branch, and the American Jewish Congress, American Jewish Committee. Basically, I mean, I have seen there's a circular from one of those organizations which essentially describes the tactics that they used, and they basically included mobilizing members of the Hastings alumni and getting them essentially to protest the conference and to put pressure on the board. So the board unfortunately responded to this pressure, and I think in a meeting that may have been illegal, or at least in violation of the board's own standing orders and bylaws, and in a closed meeting, that is to say an executive session, where records were not kept, and where there was no one present but the board members and a few other administrators. The board took an action literally at the 11th hour, that is to say late at night, the night before the conference was to begin, which forced us to change some of the publicity materials for the conference and barred our deans from welcoming the conference as had been publicly announced. This I just think is an unconscionable act on the part of the board. Fortunately, I'm really pleased to say that my faculty, my colleagues, have responded with great principle and courage, and have authored a long, thoughtful, but very critical letter that has been shared with the board. And also this past week on Wednesday night, the Associated Student Body of Hastings passed a resolution strongly critical of the board's action and calling for it to publicly explain its behavior and share its records of the meeting and identify who did what and who voted in favor of the resolution and the like. And of course, the news media is increasingly getting a hold of this story, and it will be interesting to see how our board responds. The fact is that they have acted shamefully, and they owe Hastings and the broader community an apology.
Is this kind of response maybe a signal of a greater sea change, where there's going to be less tolerance for this old style pressure campaigns to silence debate about Israel? I mean, you're someone who's been involved in this issue for quite some time. What's your sense of the way things are going?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Will. I think each situation is different. I'm not sure I'm willing to identify a pattern just yet. I've, as you probably know, and as you can see from my gray hair, I've been involved in this business for a long time, and I've seen things ebb and flow over time. In some respects, I would say that the Zionist propaganda efforts in this country are more entrenched than ever and more aggressive than ever. I mean, what the Zionist Organization of America has accomplished with the U.S. Department of Education in getting it to classify people with religious ethnic mix as being protected under the Civil Rights Act, that's a very concerning development. And it has put them in the position in some campuses here in California to claim that that the universities are in holding events that are critical of Israel, creating an intimidating atmosphere for Jewish faculty and Jewish students. And I don't think that they will prevail in these efforts, but there's no certainty of that, and it takes a lot of time and energy and resources to respond to these bogus claims. So the ground is shifting all of the time, and I think the real takeaway for those of us who do want to have a more open debate about Palestine, Israel in the United States and other issues is we can never fall asleep. We can never take anything for granted, and we have to fight every battle and defend our freedoms vigorously. I wouldn't want anybody to think that we're on the wave of a major change. It'll happen if and only if we are consistent and we don't, like I said, take anything for granted or expect that things are going to change without a lot of effort on our parts.
Thank you very much, Professor Bisharat, for joining us on Palestine Studies TV.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you, Will.